Hello, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Yeah, Stacy.
Max, we're talking about your favorite topic, Bitcoin. People will be surprised that we're talking about it again. Anyway, there's another fork in the road, was there? It's called Bitcoin Gold, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin this, Bitcoin that. We have many Bitcoins, but everybody in the world has been waiting for what the sovereign governments are going to do. They're going to shut it down. They're going to do EMPs. They're going to destroy it. They're going to take it down. Well, I have some headlines here about Russia because they have apparently made some moves on Bitcoin. I do want to say that these are all translations into English. They could be wrong or there could not be quite that much accuracy. It's hard to do coverage of countries where you don't actually speak the language because you're just reading it third hand. But Vladimir Putin mandates new rules for cryptocurrencies and ICOs. The Kremlin published 5 orders from Putin over the weekend, representing perhaps the most direct move to date by the Russian government to oversee activities around the technology. Not only do the orders from Putin mandate new legal structures around cryptocurrency within Russia, they ambitiously establish a plan to use the technology to create a single payment system within the Eurasian Economic Union, which features Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia as members. Now, we do know the one individual and company, Exante, responsible for Kazakhstan introducing a cryptocurrency and blockchain there. So that does lend credence to this story.
Yeah, there's 2 stories here. One would be crypto. The other would be de-dollarization. So Russia has an ardent hope to de-dollarize. The same hope is shared by China and Iran. And they want to get out of the dollar and escape the fate of Saddam Hussein, or escape the fate of Muammar Gaddafi, escape the fate of anyone who has tried to get out of the US dollar and met with vicious murder, right? So Russia, China, they would love to get out of the dollar. So they've got a few things happening. One is the crypto strategy. And so using crypto and a ruble coin, crypto ruble coin, it's an efficient way to conduct monetary policy in the country for sure. They also are not outlawing Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going to be, as I understand it, you can still trade in and out of Bitcoin. Mining is going to be more supervised. And so on one hand, anytime a sovereign government gets involved in Bitcoin, they usually fail because Bitcoin is post-nation state. It puts the nation state in the rearview mirror, the same way that Gutenberg Press put the Catholic Church in the rearview mirror in many ways. So there's that factor to it. But on the other hand, any attempt to de-dollarize is going to put a lot of pressure on the US dollar, and so people in America have got to take that under consideration.
Many people have been talking about de-dollarization for years. I'm not so sure that the currency aspect of this matters as much as the payment system aspect, and many people have been arguing about this for Bitcoin. Is it a store of value or is it a payment system? And this is why you see so many forks going on. Some people say, well, no, it's a payment system. We've got to compete with PayPal and Visa. Somebody else will say, well, it's a store of value and it competes with gold. So here we have, just like Jim Rickards, a frequent guest of ours who does often advise the intelligence community here in the United States, or the CIA, and he said way back years ago when Iran was cut off from the SWIFT finance system, is as soon as you do that, people are going to come up with new alternatives. And of course, cryptocurrency is a payment system as well as a store of value. So it's many things. It provides transparency for an economy that, you know, the rulers of that country, the leaders of Russia, of the central bank, they want to bring some more transparency to their own domestic economy and to flows of funds in and out of the country. China, of course, also wants that. They want to know how much is flowing out, how much is flowing in. One of the things I've read, and again, I don't know until we see it actually in action, but one of the things I read is that any of the crypto ruble, they're coming out with their own crypto ruble, according to reports, but you could transfer it immediately between this crypto ruble and Bitcoin or Ethereum or any other of the 1,000 cryptocurrencies out there in the world. But if you can't show where you acquired that initial cryptocurrency, then you will be taxed at their 15% tax rate, which is their nation's tax rate. So if you could show where you got it from, if you earned it from doing some work, somewhere, then there's no tax on it.
You make a good point there in terms of the risk of SWIFT. Has been a bad actor.
SWIFT, tell people what that is.
The SWIFT is the global banking interbank payment platform.
Financial transaction platform, yeah.
And they decided to, as per sanctions, to cut countries off off SWIFT. It could have been Iran. They threatened it with Russia. And so Russia, being a sovereign state, they don't want to be exposed to the whims of some foreign bad actor like SWIFT. And so, they'll come up with their own payment rails, their own system, and they can have a parallel payment system. And crypto and blockchain technology allows them to do that. This new crypto ruble that you mentioned allows for the mining output to be shared as a dividend.
Yeah, that's another aspect that's going on because, again, going back to these 5 points that Putin apparently made, is that one of the decrees mandates the creation of a so-called regulatory sandbox or a framework within which companies can test products in limited settings. Some countries, including the UK, have set up finance-oriented sandboxes that have attracted a number of blockchain-focused companies to date. So what has happened, there is a mining operation happening in Russia, and one of Putin's decrees is also talking about mining and how to tax that and as income.
And subsidize the mining.
Energy is subsidized. It's much lower cost there. Now, when Max and I have been going to Bitcoin conferences since 2011, what we saw, and you immediately see from all the accents, was that Eastern Europe predominated, especially in the early days. Now so many people are in it, it's hard to say any one nation dominates the space. But what one did see is that those who have the lowest cost energy win, and in the mining sector. And of course, all of the Eastern Europe has subsidized lower cost energy prices because of the Russian natural gas output. Russia has a lot of excess energy production themselves domestically. So there is a party, a group who are basically offering a dividend in the actual revenues. So you would, investing in this, you would get 18% of the revenues of the mining operation.
It's like Dash. Dash shares a portion of the mining output with the mother nodes, the super nodes, the master nodes. Okay, so Russia is saying, if we understand this to be the case, that the part of this mining output or all of the mining output will be shared universally across the system. So you could be like universal basic income suddenly, a variation on Marxist theory.
Well, it's definitely a way to share the national wealth, because right now you have a handful of oligarchs who are able to control all the output of the wealth of the nation, which is the natural gas and oil. So it just comes out.
Well, that's an excellent point, which I hadn't thought of. In other words, in Alaska, people get a dividend from the energy.
Yes.
So here in Russia, they can subsidize energy and share that with folks in Russia vis-a-vis the crypto ruble coin mining output that they're talking about.
They don't need to subsidize energy. It just comes out cheaply. It comes out freely.
It does come out cheaply, and so mining gravitates toward China where it's very low.
This is another interesting point, because there was a Money 2020 conference, and Bobby Lee was just speaking there, and he talked about Bitcoin and what's happening in China. And one of the things that the Chinese government is cracking down on, why China does dominate or did dominate anyway in the mining sector, was because they were all stealing electricity. So they were just tapping into the electric grid and stealing.
Right.
So now the Chinese government is cracking down on that. So you can't just take your energy, your electricity for free to run your mining rig. So now this is a good opportune time for somewhere like Russia, somewhere like Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Algeria, wherever they have natural gas and cheaper costs. Venezuela, they're soaring in the mining sector because they have subsidized cost for their energy.
Right, and this is the bleeding edge of the crypto revolution, is in Venezuela, because here you have a currency collapse, and people are surviving by mining crypto, and 100,000 mining operations in Venezuela. This is the revolution that I've been talking about for years now. This is the post-nation-state revolution. Venezuela is leaving the nation-state behind. The nation-state in Venezuela is collapsing, and what will emerge is a crypto-driven society of regions and tribes and sectors.
Voluntary.
Voluntarianism.
I mean, it makes sense. Hopefully this is all true, what's going on here, because Russia, RT certainly is at the forefront of discussing and popularizing and making Bitcoin a global international success. I think the fact that Keiser Report has been covering it since it was $2, and we're the only global news channel to be doing that, the only television news to cover it by 3 or 4 years.
RT's been the most active covering Bitcoin for the last 6 years of any other network in the world by a huge factor, 20, 30 times. And this show, Keiser Report, has been the show most actively covering Bitcoin in the entire platform as well. So, and because I believe in the post-nation state world, that Bitcoin is ushering in, and it's an era of freedom.
So, and a genuine globalization without
and
all
why
these
is Russia
toll booths.
going in that direction? Because they don't like to be under the yoke of sanctions and a dollar-dominated world. So they're moving into another direction.
So here is another headline: breaking Russia issuing crypto ruble. Now this is the contentious point because they're creating their own crypto ruble. They mine it, nobody else can mine it, and this is a blockchain. It is an experiment. We see this happening with Bitcoin. Bitcoin was the one and only cryptocurrency, and then others emerged, and now Bitcoin is splitting in many different forks and many different debates. And at the end of the day, somebody will win. A lot of people will say, a nation state can't issue their own cryptocurrency and it won't work. I believe Canada already tried it and they failed. But here, let's see what happens. But
it won't work. I mean, essentially, because cryptocurrency is by definition decentralized, and so a central entity like a sovereign state cannot issue a cryptocurrency as such. But I think that there are bigger or other factors at play. The move to de-dollarize, the move to, as you point out, push the dividend from energy to Siberian provinces. Okay, there's a lot you can do with a blockchain, but they're not going to compete with Bitcoin. It's not going to usurp Bitcoin because it's a centralized entity, and you can't come. The nation state is kaput. Fini. What's the word in Russian? Finito. Capito. Borscht. I like borscht. I like hot borscht. I used to get it at the Russian tea room with Woody Allen. I saw Woody Allen there once.
You were hanging out with Woody Allen?
Yeah, in the 1970s. He was with Dick Cavett in the Russian tea room in New York. I was with my parents. And I had a lovely chicken Kiev and hot borscht. And then I went to see some show on Broadway, because that's the way it was back in the 70s.
Okay.
Well, we gotta go.
I think it's time to exit and head to the second half. Stage left.
Second half, stage left?
You notice that theater reference I gave?
Oh, I thought that was more of a lefty politics reference. Okay. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our discussion with Marshall Auerback. He's an author, strategic thinker, famous guy. Look him up. You'll find out this guy's the guy to follow. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Did you like that introduction?
Very flattering. I'm
All right. I want to just dive right into this here. So from 88 to 91, you were based in Tokyo. So what are your thoughts about Abe's landslide victory in the recent snap election? Markets there are soaring, even more than the U.S. Why? Tell us about it.
Well, bear in mind, the markets are soaring, but they're still well below where they were back in 1989 when the Nikkei Dow almost hit 40,000. So, there is a sense that things are politically stable, that Abe will undertake more deregulation. So in that sense, it's like the U.S. markets seem to love tax cuts, deregulation. He's not conducting an overtly strict fiscal policy. But the other factor is that I think Mr. Abe owes a debt of gratitude to Kim Jong-un, because I think that what's been going on in North Korea he's a nationalist by temperament, Abe that is, and I think that what has been happening on the North Korean side of the Korean Peninsula has encouraged him to adopt a more hawkish tone in regards to reforming the Constitution, having a bigger defense build-up, and that didn't play well maybe 20 years ago. It's playing more, it's a more popular hymn right now in Japan than it was beforehand.
Right, so pacifism was the order of the day for many, many years, post-World War II. And now, recently, they've become more overtly nationalistic and beating the war drums when necessary.
I think they've always been somewhat more nationalistic than the popular perception. When I was living there, they used to have these guys and these ultra-hardcore nationalists. They would go around of these noisy vans was playing all these old Japanese imperial tunes, and they would start blasting away propaganda at various in various.
Now, I have not
areas.
been to Tokyo. Dying to go. And
it's a great city.
Just a quick aside here. It looks like it's completely freaky. Like they do freaky things. They engage in odd social customs. The youth movement is it as weird? I mean, you can buy all kinds of things in vending machines that you can't imagine. Is what's going on there? Give us the insider look.
Well, it's a very, very odd. How inside do you want to go? No, it's an odd society because on the surface it's very, very orderly, meticulously well structured, and it's got a very hierarchical social structure. It's even reflected in the language. But there is this underbelly, which is quite wild, libertine, almost like Weimar Berlin in the 1920s, and that almost acts like a social safety valve, which I think helps to sustain the underlying structure, which maintains this orderliness. But the two things tend to coexist very easily because the city does function very well. So does Osaka, and it's very safe. You can walk anywhere in that. Tokyo, Yokohama, Chiba. That's about 30 million people right there. You never feel unsafe. Crime is very, very low. Even organized crime is organized to a degree that's
very organized.
So it's quite a remarkable place.
Wow. Do you have any tattoos?
No, I did not get tattoos.
So keeping on the Japan thing, story. So they have been now for many years the go-to country to get cheap money because interest rates are super low.
They were.
Okay, is that changing? And if so, is the 30-year bull market in bonds that we've seen, for the past 30 years, are they part of that? And is there a change coming? Your thoughts?
They are a source of it. I think an old friend of mine, Doug Nolan, used to say that, liquidity abhors a vacuum, and that, financially stressed institutions will go anywhere where there is a provision of easy liquidity. And
the prudent bear, Doug Nolan.
Right.
Where's Doug Nolan these days?
Doug was with Federated. He's now happily out in Oregon these days. But he made the point that, if there is someone offering low cost money, it will be found. And, for a while it was Japan. Now the ECB seems to be the big provider of
Then
low
how
rates.
come in America, when the interest rates are super low, they say we have to keep rates low because there's no demand for money. There's no demand for credit. They say there's no demand for credit in America. So
I think they want to keep rates low because absolute levels of debt are still very, very high in the U.S.
But so they are the same in Japan.
Yeah,
Japan is the most debted country in the world.
Japan, it's interesting. The composition is virtually it's all public debt, and it's all owned by a large number of it is owned by government entities. So I always tell people that when you're talking about high debt levels, you really got to distinguish between private and public debt. So in Japan, what's happened is they effectively took out all the private sector debt. They've put it on their national balance sheets. But the people that have been saying this is going to create some hyper Weimar inflationary type of situation.
They're drawing on, as you point out, the government was drawing on its pension funds. The postal system had these enormous pools of capital. Yeah. But it seems like aren't they within recent past going into the wholesale market and borrowing money globally now? They can't really fund it internally.
Well, the irony is right now in Japan is that, you have an aging population and you have pension funds with significant actuarial demands or returns which are not commensurate.
So they're kind of like ran out of that free money. To a degree.
Well,
and if so, they're exposed to interest rates rising as a risk that they haven't had for a while.
But the central bank there, because it's all yen-denominated debt, they can keep rates at whatever they want to do. I mean, there's no problem. The people that have been trying to short the Japanese government bond market for the last 20, 25 years, and you would have gone bankrupt doing that. The problem, debt crises historically arise, and financial crises historically arise when you have large levels of private debt, which is what happened in Japan in the 1980s, or you have a large component of foreign debt, which is what happened in Asia in the late 1990s, the Asian financial crisis.
Okay, you are a specialist in the Minsky Economic School, which can identify bubbles, and you talked about Japan. You talked about 1989.
Yeah.
That was private debt, and that was a Minsky moment. Everything got asset prices hyperinflated to incredible valuations.
That's right.
It was 40,000 almost on the Nikkei index, crashed down to 8,000. And they're still working through what they call the lost decade, or now lost 2 decades.
Yeah, I think that's overstated.
Talk about that.
The problem was that there was stagnant growth because I think the Japanese ran a very inconsistent fiscal policy, because every time, you know, they got these debt level up to public debt levels up to a very large level, and the IMF said to them, well, you've got to cut that back, and you've got to start, you know, raising taxes and reining in all this debt, which they did. First time in the mid-1990s, they doubled the consumption tax, which of course caused the economy to go into a recession again, because the underlying economy was still in a very fragile position. And every time they've introduced reasonable fiscal stimulus, the economy has grown 2.5–3%. Then the IMF gives them this pernicious advice again, saying you've got to cut this back, you've got to cut back government spending, and that's what's caused the problems. Now they're basically leaving it alone.
What about the 3 arrows of Abe? Did that work? I haven't heard about the 3 arrows.
Not really.
What were the 3 arrows?
Well, I think they're some form of political reform, deregulation, and you know. But he also talked about getting government finances back in good shape again, which is a terrible mistake. He tried that again in his first term of office. He increased the consumption tax again, and lo and behold, the economy fell down again. But if you actually go to Tokyo right now, go any place in Japan right now, unemployment's pretty low. And on most other measures of social welfare, education, they stack up better than the U.S.
So it's like 300% to GDP, right?
No, it's about 200, but that's a gross number. The net, it's much lower than that. You know, it's closer,
how do you net that out?
Well, because a lot of it's owned by government institutions. Okay, so if you actually take the amount net of the net outside the government, you're probably looking at more like 140%. So in that regard, not that different from the U.S. And
that's not the double accounting gobbledygook you're trying to massage numbers with?
No.
So if that's the story, then they are not in the debt crisis some would have us believe.
No, I think the Japan debt crisis is a made-up story. That's real fake news.
Okay. So if that's the case, then that global bond market that feeds off those super cheap rates is also not at any immediate stage of collapsing.
No, because you have to go from country to country. Look, as I said.
But they're all connected, and Japan is the source for the ultra cheap money.
I don't think Japan is as much a source. It was
the
a
carry
source.
Trade, you know?
The carry trade, Japan was a large source.
It still is.
No, not really. I think a lot of people got squeezed out of that when the yen, strengthened to about 75 to the dollar. So I think more of the carry trade is coming out. More funding is in the late 2000s. In the 2000s, most of that funding was coming from the U.S. and you had a dollar liquidity crisis post 2008. So it wasn't a yen-driven crisis.
Okay, so fair enough. But you do see some risk in the bonds, not coming from there, but coming from somewhere else, perhaps.
Yeah, it could be. You could have an accident in the eurozone if there's another mistake made in policy there. You could also have it in the U.S. as well. Yeah.
Trump, how's he doing?
Well, I think
our president.
He's a disaster. But,
how so? We have about 2 minutes.
That's probably not.
Sorry, we're out of time. No. We have about 2 minutes. But I think there was actually a question relating to this. But anyway, Trump, what is? Give us your take.
I will say that Trump is a consequence, not a cause. I mean, in the sense that I think people have consistently voted for change in the U.S. since 2006. Every single election they vote for change, and it's not being delivered. In the meantime, you've had growing inequality, an increasing amount of benefits.
Remember, Carter was a reaction to Nixon. You know, and Obama was a reaction to Bush.
Yeah, but Obama came into office promising, remember, it was change you can believe in, and I don't think things fundamentally changed.
But he was a freshman guy. He threw the Hail Mary like Bush was so terrible. We're going to give it to this guy. He sounds and looks like Marvin Gaye. How bad could this be?
He did a good job his first couple of years with regard to his fiscal policy rescue, for example. But if you actually look at what he did on financial reform, it's nothing compared to say what FDR did in the aftermath of the Great Depression.
He actually counts out to the bankers.
Yeah, exactly, and he didn't jail one of them.
He bailed out the creditors instead of the debtors.
He bailed out the creditors instead of the debtors, and likewise, arguably, you could say that his health care policy is the same thing. It's a bailout of private health insurance companies. So that's one of the annoying things about Trump is there's a grain of truth in a lot of what he says, even though it's bastardized by so much of the nonsense that surrounds it.
Let me ask you a philosophical question. That with Trump, what America sees, I've lived overseas most of my adult life. And when you leave America and you talk to people living overseas, their perception of America is someone like Donald Trump, for the most part.
Well, he does represent a constituency.
But
they've been ones that have been ignored by the body politic for the last 30 or 40 years. So there's
kind of a bully, loudmouth, not terribly sophisticated New Yorker. I mean, this is what people.
Borough New Yorker, so he's that's another thing. But yeah, he's not a sophisticated Manhattanite by any stretch.
Right, exactly. He's from Queens.
Yeah.
You go to when
they also
people
thought
hate. What my question is philosophically, when the media elite at the New York Times or Saturday Night Live, when they criticize Trump, aren't they in fact a little bit misplaced in that they are criticizing themselves? This is who we are. Trump is us. We are Trump.
He's a part of it. He's an aspect of it that they don't choose to acknowledge. But I think there's something to be said for that. Look, I'm from Toronto originally, and we had a crack smoking mayor there named Rob Ford. And everyone was very embarrassed about the guy. But he had a core. It's a microcosm of what we have in the States. He had a core of supporters in the suburbs that actually loved the guy and kept on re-electing him.
I love that comparison. That's fantastic. All right, Marshall, we're out of time. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Max. Thanks for having me.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. Thanks to our guest, Marshall Auerback. He's an author, and find him on guy's genius. Find us on Twitter at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.